Welcome to Stories with Traction, unedited and unfiltered. These are real conversations with leaders who have walked through trials and triumph. In a world of AI-polished sound bites and scripted perfection, this podcast isn't about being flawless. It's about being purposeful. I'm your host, Matt Zahn. We're going to find out what drives these leaders, what's their story, and how can we learn from their experiences. Get inspired and enjoy Stories with Traction. Ricardo, welcome back to the Stories with Traction podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be back. It's been, 2 or 3 years, I think, since
It has been. It's been a few years. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate what you do, Ricardo. Your work has had a really big impact on me. You know, the first time you were on the podcast was July 1st of 2022. That was a year into my podcast journey. That was episode 25. And we did an episode called Company Culture Statement Needed, where you dove into what a company culture statement is, how can leaders implement that. And then you came back January 27th of 2023, and we did a two-part series. This was episode 55 and 56. Part one was company culture, definition, benefits, and strategies. And part two was company culture and trauma. It was incredible. Right. And I learned so much based on those episodes. I will include them in the show notes. People can click. They can listen to those episodes for themselves. I would highly encourage that they do that. And it had such an impact on me that I actually included some of the strategies and concepts in my book that launched the Story Bank, Strategic Stories That Work. I mentioned your framework, Ricardo, regarding beliefs, values, norms, language, and symbols, right? And you dove into that in the podcast on what that means for organizations. And that's really where I want to start. I want to backtrack and I want to talk about those concepts and then what it means today in our AI world. So can you just take a few moments to catch my listeners up to speed regarding, you know, how you shape organizational culture through what you mentioned, those 5 really important categories: beliefs, values, norms, language, and symbols?
Sure. So in the macro, you have a couple of questions that need to be answered. First, what is culture? And that's what you're referring to. It is a series of beliefs, values, norms. Norms are expectations. You know, how do we expect people to behave within that culture, right? So beliefs, values, norms, symbols, and language, right? And so normally when we look at from the external, from the form standpoint, and we look at culture, mostly we're looking at symbols. So we're looking at things like dress, music, food, you know. So every time you go to like a culture festival, right, it's almost all symbols. You know, so people in folklore dress, traditional music. Recently, you know, the big thing about the Super Bowl halftime show, well, it was filled. You know, whatever one's view of Bad Bunny, who's Puerto Rican, same country I'm from. Okay, so whatever view of whether you like his music or not, that really wasn't his point. The point was a cultural statement. And it wasn't a statement against America. It was a statement mostly for Puerto Rico and for Latin American culture. But if you really understood like all of the symbolism within that show, you would go, oh my gosh. And so people typically externally present their culture through symbols. Okay. Sometimes externally through language and how we talk about that, right? Or maybe how we sing about that. But those are kind of the two external kind of things that we typically see. But the real kind of under the iceberg, what's really going on in the culture, which we don't talk a lot about because it's uncomfortable for people, I think. And that's our beliefs, our values, and our norms, right? That's what really drives the culture. So that's the first thing, Matt, I would say. And that is, you know, let's answer that one first big macro question. What is culture? Culture is a series of internal beliefs, values, and norms, which are shown externally through symbols and language. I
Yeah,
added that. We didn't talk about that in the last time. We didn't do the division between the external and the internal, but there is that balance, right? All right. So here's the other question. And I think this is even more important, maybe, for leaders. Okay. And that is, how do we create culture? Okay. Or perhaps, how does it get created? Because we have both possibilities. We can create it, or it will get created for us, right?
sure.
And and those are the two big macros. And I know that I mentioned this because I typically will. Every time I do like meet with an executive C-suite group, and we're discussing, and they want to talk about their organizational culture, which is it's just culture, right? And so I always ask at the beginning. So let's say you have a CEO, CFO, COO, CMO, CSO, C whatever, right? In that meeting. So let's say there are 8 people, 10 people in that meeting. And I give them a blank piece of paper and I ask each one of them to write down their definition of their organizational culture. And this has been true every time. I've never had one outlier on this. All of them define it differently. So I always go, okay, so if within this group of high level leaders, we're not even fully aligned on what our culture is, how in the world could the people in the associates throughout the organization have a clue as to what our culture is, right?
Yeah.
So there's a huge lack of clarity all through the organization on, first of all, what culture even is, but secondly, what ours is, right? So that's big, big picture.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. I do want to dive a little bit deeper into that clarity piece because you had mentioned like I'm envisioning this as you're speaking, right? You're in a boardroom, you give out the instructions for this exercise and you're starting to read them and they're all different. But my question to you regarding that, Ricardo, is how important is unity as it pertains to the definition of culture versus flexibility? Meaning, if you have different departments in a company, like larger departments, could each of those departments have their own cultures within a broader culture? So wouldn't they naturally be a little bit different? Or do you highly recommend that there is unity regarding the definition of that culture?
So if you do not have a clear and compelling macro culture to which everyone within an organization aligns, then you will get the creation of subcultures or microcultures within the organization. I am of the
Is that
opinion,
dangerous? That's
yes,
dangerous. Okay.
yes, it is not culturally healthy to have that, especially to have that where that is driving the culture of the company by almost by proxy. I believe, and we talked about this when I talked about culture statement. I believe that everyone within an organization should agree on certain non-negotiable beliefs, values, norms, symbols, and language. If you look, I think the best example we have of this is probably in two places. I'll give two examples. I think in highly successful sport franchises or teams, they will always talk about their culture and they will always talk about how everyone's on the same page and how everyone fulfills their roles within that culture. Everyone's aligned to that. They're in agreement. Okay. Always. The other place I think we could look is the military. where there's a very defined set of cultural beliefs, values, norms, symbols, language. So I think we confuse the concept. This. So what I would ask for your listeners as we have this conversation, Matt, I always talk about open heart, open mind. Because some things we've been kind of conditioned in our culture as it regards talking about culture, that if I don't immediately get it, or maybe I don't agree, I just turn it off. So, what I would ask from your listeners as we're going through this conversation or we're having this conversation, that open mind, open heart, things will make more sense as we go through, right? So, I'm going to use a term that everybody uses. I think we have confused this idea of diversity, inclusion with culture. They're not the same thing. Can you have diversity within a culture? Yes. Can you have a large diversity of beliefs within a healthy culture? No. They're two separate things. We have to be aligned on certain non negotiable beliefs, values, norms, language, symbol. Or frankly, we don't have a culture, or we have a very weak one, or we have one that's just being produced for us almost on the fly. Yeah. Does that make sense or no?
Absolutely, 100%. And I appreciate you mentioning that. And that makes a lot of sense from the beliefs perspective. So that's a really powerful statement regarding, you can't have a large diversity of beliefs within a healthy culture. I can see how that would be to the organization's detriment. I do want to talk a little bit about the values piece for a moment, because a lot of companies will tout, their values, and often they speak to the words of those values. One of the things that I do in all of my workshops is I challenge my listeners to not focus on the words of the values. Don't focus on company core values, focus on company core stories that exemplify the values that you say you have. And the reason why this is really important for me is if you have a leader talking about integrity, right? There's a textbook definition of what integrity is. We can all look up what it actually means, but it could mean different things to different organizations based on the story of what integrity means to them, like very specific examples of how that organization has that integrity. And I think that really ties well into the culture piece, because as they do this, they build a company culture of storytelling, and they continue to share stories that fit into that integrity piece. And you could pick any value that's out there, right? I think it's also important because the words are not sticky, it's the stories. And I like to, you mentioned an exercise that you do. I like to do a simple exercise, and I ask everyone, write out all your company values. Very few people in a room can actually write out all of the values because the words aren't sticky. So I want you to speak to the value piece and why it is so important to understand the values from a story perspective and how this can enhance someone's culture.
So I concur and agree with you on the importance of stories. That they're critical, right? But they're the outgrowth. Everything is inside out, right? You know, and so take your word integrity, which is a great word. I bring a little additional meaning to that, if I may. So in Spanish, like if you have whole bread, right? Like whole grain bread, it's called pan integral, which basically means integrity bread. It's whole. It's naturally full. Yeah. So integrity in its etymology or in its root means wholeness. Okay. I can't be whole, an organization can't be whole if we have multiple sets of beliefs and values all over the place that are not aligned, right? So, how do we tell that story and what is that story? And I would back it up a little bit personally because I understand the importance of values, but if I'm talking about values independent of a clear understanding of my belief system or our belief system in an organization, whatever it is we happen to believe, okay? Because beliefs drive values. So I can't talk about values in a vacuum. I can't. It just doesn't work within a cultural construct. Okay. And so that might sound to some people like, just convoluted, but it's not. There is a very precise order in which these things kind of work with each other. So my beliefs will create my values, and my values are simply what's important to us, right? Those are our values. Our beliefs are producing what's important to us. Okay. So, for example, if I say, I believe that all people deserve to be treated with treatment would be treated with dignity, or all people have intrinsic dignity and worth. If I say that as a belief, then that is going to touch my value, right, of how I treat people, which will drive me into the norm, my expectation of there is an expectation in this organization because we believe this, we value this, that you're not going to yell at people, you're not going to degrade people. That's part of our norm system because it's coming out of values and beliefs. And so you can kind of take that way. How you create stories around that exemplary, I think, is critically important because it illustrates, stories illustrate, right? But at its core, culture is not story based. The stories are the external reflection of what's really going on. Just like the story of our lives, what people see in us is just a reflection, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he, right? And the same is true in organizational culture. As we think, as we believe, that outgrowth will begin to happen. I don't want to get too convoluted on it, but I do think order, I think it's important, especially for an organization that's struggling through their organizational culture, to get this granular with it and to really think through each particular step of it. If in fact our goal is to create the culture that we so desire, whatever
Yeah,
that happens to be.
yeah, those are really good points, Ricardo. I really appreciate you mentioned that. I do have a question on timing regarding beliefs and values. The speed at which the world is changing is unbelievable. And a lot of values that I've seen from companies is they go through maybe an exercise at some point, or maybe it happens organically from that value piece. They don't think a lot of in terms of beliefs and everything that you're talking about. They end up putting values on their website, and then a decade will go by and they still have the exact same values. So even though we should be constantly be thinking about our values and our beliefs and as we interact with people from a business perspective or even nonprofits as well, what do you recommend for organizations to from a timing perspective on them evaluating if the values are still the values that they should have for today? Meaning, should they be thinking about this, or at least sitting down with their leaders and thinking about this on a yearly basis, quarterly basis? Or do you think it is appropriate for people to have the same values for decades?
So take a company like, say, Chick-fil-A. Okay. So, whatever one's viewpoint of Chick-fil-A, it's not the point of this conversation. Okay. The point is culture, right? So, True Cathy had a belief that Sunday was Lord's Day. That was his belief. Again, irrelevant if you share that belief or not, this is strictly a conversation in how culture and values get created, right? Okay, so the belief is Sunday is the Lord's day. In his belief, that's the way the company was founded. To this day, on Chick-fil-A signs, there's right underneath their sign says closed Sundays, right? Okay. So if you take that belief and you go, okay, well, what's the value that's coming out of that? Okay. Well, the value is there's one day a week that we're going to give off to our associates, so they can be in worship with their families, whatever they choose to do with that day. That's important to them. The norm is every franchisee is not asked, right? Is not suggested you close Sundays. They're required. It is an expectation. And that creates part of that Chick-fil-A story. It creates a tremendous amount of loyalty within a certain segment of society, right? They know who their clients are. Okay. Now, could it change at some point with different leadership? Sure. That, you know, but in order for it to change, and this is the key, in order for it to change, the underlying belief would have to change. So the Chick-fil-A story, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Again, I've been to their offices. We have clients with Chick-fil-A. I see what they've tried. They're very intentional about their culture. Okay. But I think that's the story. It's the outlay of it, but it's all rooted in a very specific belief, creates the values. And again, it's people hear terms like values and norms, and maybe it doesn't, just think in terms of what's important to us and what we expect people to do within our world. Okay. That's what, and if that's not happening, it's not a culture. It's just a very loosely tied group of people who happen to work together to make money together, to promote a product together or a service together. But that's not a culture. There are many organizations, many, I might say most, who actually, they don't even have an organizational culture. There's just a bunch of people getting together around the idea of making enough money, being viable in the marketplace, and selling a product or service that they believe in. But they're not a culture. And that may hit difficult for some leaders to hear. Okay. But it's true. And sometimes truth is uncomfortable. Uh, okay. But step it back a little bit. Okay. So we can either create a culture, right? So there are three things that you can do. You can create a culture, right? And that can be created intentionally by leadership, which I prefer. Okay. But most leaders, it takes a great deal of thoughtfulness and intention and commitment to do this. The easier way is to put out a bunch of rules and stuff to try to control people enough so it doesn't get out of hand. That's not culture. And we'll all rally around Pringles. I don't know, whatever the product happens to be, could be Doritos. It could be, it doesn't matter. It could be XYZ widget. And we call it, this is our culture, XYZ widget. That's not a culture. We're selling something. We're all coming together to sell something, hopefully make enough money but we all go our separate ways, and we're okay. A culture, again, is a series of common beliefs, values, norms, symbols, and language. In a really healthy culture, we all speak with each other in very similar ways. We use similar language. We have symbols that, companies try to get around this. They like their logo is their symbol. which may or may not mean something, you know. Um, I think you take a company like Nike, you know, just do it. There is a certain cultural story behind that that goes with their running, you know, the past that, you know, they started for runners and, you know, and all of that stuff. So there's that story, you know. Um, but most organizational cultures, I'm gonna say this, most organizational cultures aren't
Yeah, that's what I
because
think
we're
too.
afraid today, especially today, we are afraid to quote unquote impose a certain set of beliefs, values, because we value diversity above that. And Peter Drucker has this famous quote: culture eats strategy for breakfast. Diversity is a strategy, it is not a culture. And I'm all for diversity as long as within that diversity there is a macro culture that we all align to. It doesn't matter what color we are, it doesn't matter what race we are. We can all have aligned beliefs, we can all have aligned values. I mean, if we're defining those things by color, we're in bad shape. So this is fascinating to me. So I saw yesterday, you know, I try to stay up on, you know, news, and also I don't like it, but I try to stay up on people's social media posts, you know, different leaders, see what people are saying. And and this is the dichotomy of what we see, and um, perhaps even hypocrisy. I don't know. So I saw a Latino leader yesterday on one of his social media feeds. I won't say who, it doesn't matter. A friend of mine. And he's saying, we need to make sure we get more Latinos in elected office and so on and so forth. Sounds great, right? And then I'm looking at news in Latin America and I see that Peru, the country of Peru, has just removed from office their sixth president in a row. And you're going, well, wait a minute. Do we want that? Because that's what's happened so much of Latin America with our leadership and levels of corruption in our governments. You see dichotomy that happens, right? So I'm not going to vote. I'm Puerto Rican background. I've lived half my life in Latin America. I'm not going to vote in the United States for a Latino just because that person is Latino. I'm going to vote for that person based on a set of beliefs, values, norms, things that align with me as a human, not things that align with a specific level of my identity. And I think that we have to be, when there's culture that is defined and refined, that culture is bigger and beyond any subgroups of people. And that's why I think it's so important to establish the macro culture properly. You can create it. After you create it, you have to curate it. Yes, it takes work to keep it, right? And if you don't, it's just going to get loosely created for you, and you're going to have all of these different subgroups, and there won't be a clearly defined culture. It's a choice. I'll stop right there. It's a choice. It's a choice. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. No, I appreciate everything you mentioned, a lot of value. So speaking of choice, as you know, right now, a lot of companies are making a choice to lean in as hard as possible to AI, right? And I'm sure this is going to open up all kinds of different potential discussions, but I am interested to know what you might be seeing regarding AI, how it's
Oof.
impacting culture, how it's shaping culture, any differences in the last few years based on,
Yeah.
because you've been teaching this stuff for quite a
Yeah.
while. What
Yeah.
what has happened regarding beliefs, values, norms as it pertains to AI technology?
It's a fantastic discussion, Matt. A lot. First of all, a lot. Gosh, there's so many different routes we could take this. Okay, but let me preface with this. I love AI. I embrace it. We have Bilingual America now. We now have virtual tutors who I think are Honestly, almost as good as our real ones. They're incredibly trained. They're programmed to do coaching. They're programmed to do conversations. They're programmed to give feedback. I mean, it's amazing what we can do with AI when it's used responsibly. Here's the problem, or the challenge we have. Oh, I mentioned to you and off recording that I was doing some consulting for a couple companies in Sacramento. So I was flying out, and when I was flying out, they paid for my trip. So thankfully, I was flying business class, and it turned out that the person right next to me ended up being the global head for Amazon Prime. So we were in this discussion about AI, and I asked him, and the company I'm consulting with, one of the companies I'm consulting with in Sacramento, is a very, very large construction company that employs thousands of Latinos. Okay, so we're doing culture, leadership development, all that good stuff in that company. Okay, because that's another part of culture, and that is how do we train and develop leaders in the American business culture who have been acclimated to a Latino business culture or leadership model. Those models are, in fact, different. So we have to recalibrate that, right? Okay. Anyway, so I asked this guy, this is to your question. I asked this guy, I won't say his name, um, how many years before you think we will see robots doing some of the field work that is now being done by a heavy Latino workforce, things like uh, maybe concrete or roofing or things of that nature. And you're going to get different opinions, but the guy looks at me without batting an eye, without even thinking about it. He says 3 years. What are the cultural implications of the United States if you have a displaced Latino workforce of millions of people over time? I don't know, but it can be huge, right? And one of the things that I'm doing with Latino leaders is starting to say to them, hey, as leaders, we have a responsibility to our people to start preparing people for this next world, right? And if not, people are going to be incredibly displaced. Look, I think the biggest challenge to with AI as it relates to culture is trust, because we no longer know if literally people will not know if they watch a video of you and I, they will not know today whether or not it's actually you and I or whether they're clones of you and I. It's that good right now. We have an erosion of trust. So cloning is a huge challenge with AI as it relates to societal trust. Am I speaking with you? Is this video I'm watching of you doing something you shouldn't be doing actually you or not you? So we thought it was bad before when a hit piece would come out in a newspaper. What about when you actually see the video of someone doing something, looks just like them, talks just like them, acts just like them, but it's AI and you don't know? So I think that our biggest challenge right now with AI uh, culturally will be a continued erosion of trust. Same thing is happening on social media, which you're well aware. How do we know, even if news is true, and how do we know if this so-called expert is actually, they're teaching you how to make a couple $1 million a year, putting up your online course. Where's the credential? Did they really do it? You know what I mean? So I think one of the things we're seeing with all of this is there's an erosion of trust that's happening, which I used to say, Latin America is kind of a zero trust society where people don't trust you unless you gain it over time. Where America used to be, we would trust people until they showed us they couldn't be trusted. But that's changing rapidly. And that is a very definitive change in our cultural construct. It will impact business significantly because when trust is low, it will take more time to do business together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So speaking of that erosion of trust piece, is it possible to get some of the really good advantages of AI, but still keep trust intact? And if so, what would you recommend to companies that might have experienced a little bit of an erosion of trust?
Well, I do this like in my writing or, things like this. I will always say, this is this is my I have like an ethics statement as it relates to my use of AI. You know, I think as leaders we can do that. Just to preclude a little bit. Um, there, I'm happy to openly share with people how I will leverage AI in my writing, but I won't let it write for me, and it doesn't come up with my ideas for me. I think those have to be totally observational. You know, what's vision and leadership? So most people, when they think of vision and leadership, they think about somebody who's able to see kind of into the future. I think there's a different way to see that, and that is vision is as a leader is can you see things in the present that other people aren't seeing, right? So I think we have to be more proactive in letting people know here's why you can trust me, right? Because there is a definitive erosion of trust that's going on. And some of that has happened because of our politics. We're in a very deep swing of extremes, in our country. And so there's a pull this way, and then there's a pull this way, and then there's a counter pull. And every time we seem to be pulling a little bit farther and harder, you know? and and so that erodes public trust as a culture, as a society. And I think we have lost in the United States at least, and I assume that, at least a good portion of your listenership is probably in the US. We have lost trust to some degree at least, and I think it's accelerating in some of our systems of checks and balances, because like it used to be we would all go, our government is safe because we have all these checks and balances. But it feels like more and more it's more about checkmate than it is checks and balances, right? And I think I'm not a futurist. I'm not Alvin Toffler, but I think we're heading for a day in the United States, just like Peru is recalling their sixth president in a row. I think we're heading for those days if we don't correct our culture. I think it's scary. But I think we're running a real risk right now of moving that way. And we need a significant movement of leaders who will pull us back to the center. And somehow where we can create together a more clear macro culture for this country as to who we are and what we're all about. Because right now we're like two countries, and then there's people in the middle who are just kind of like they're half drowning, and they're like, how do I stay afloat in this? And do I really have to pick sides? I don't really like either side. I don't want to, you know what I'm saying? And so it's like it's culturally consternation, I think. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that I think another thing that we're seeing in our culture that has accelerated in the last 5 years is loneliness. Um, there's even some articles out there called The Lonely Generation, which is talking about this new generation of young people. We've become so addicted to our screens that we no longer, we don't have this human connection that we used to. And that's a cultural risk. And we've got to come back to our belief. Do we believe that human connection is important? I've dealt with this ethically as we implement virtual tutors in our program. And what we did, Matt, was, and this may help leaders. I don't know, I mean, it's just stuff we all struggle. We're all going to have to struggle through. I think maybe I'm a little further down the curve than some, but just because of my background and what I've worked with. But when we realized that we could accomplish from a results standpoint, very similar results with properly trained and coached virtual tutors who do coaching and writing and revision processes and conversations, like real conversations. Like if you ask one of our virtual tutors where it's from, it will tell you. It will tell you what kind of food it likes. It'll be able to have those conversations almost like a real person.
Wow.
Okay. But what we did, I think, to kind of buffer that, and I think that's a good word for leaders today, is to buffer these things, is something we never had done before in our programs. And that was we now have everyone who comes into our language programs is assigned a success coach, a human success coach that they can message directly if they feel stuck, they don't understand something, or they have a need. So we have these wonderful opportunities with leveraging AI, which is this, every one of us has a genius in our pocket, you know. At the same time, we still have this opportunity now for humanity, right? So I heard this quote the other day from the CEO of 7-Eleven, and he said CEO means change equals opportunity, right? That's pretty good. And then I started thinking about it just because I'm a word guy. And I thought challenge equals opportunity, right? Challenge equals opportunity. Change creates the challenge. Problem isn't change. That's a given. It's the challenge that challenges us, right? So that challenge creates the opportunity to do something different, do something unique, do something special. So when we started going into this whole virtual tutoring thing on language, at the same time, we go, okay, we do believe in the value of human connection. Well, what do we create? Well, we create a success coach who can be out there, everybody can connect with. So now we have direct messaging within our portal, all that good stuff. I think companies should start thinking, and I'm working with 3 companies right now on doing this, is every company I think should start thinking in terms of creating an app for their company that is specific to culture, communications, and development and human connection that will allow groups of people within the organization to connect directly there, will allow us to see these relationships properly, because we in our culture are becoming so disconnected, Matt, that if we don't proactively create connection, it won't happen. So we have to decide, do we want a connected culture? Well, you can't have a culture that's not connected. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of AI and all of the technology that we're seeing is it creates this incredible opportunity. I mean, look, you and I both know this. There are people who have already ordered their robot girlfriends, right? Because they don't question, they don't challenge me. And so we're moving into an age in which if people want, they can be disconnected. But the very technology disconnects us as well. And you combine that with the erosion of trust. I think that's a big thing. Now we have a greater cultural challenge. Does this, I don't know. Does this make sense? I mean, is this,
100%. 100%. I really appreciate everything that you mentioned. I really appreciate this conversation, Ricardo. You offered a ton of value. You mentioned that word challenge. I challenge everyone that listened to this episode. I really challenge you to focus in on the 2 questions, Ricardo, that you brought up in the very beginning. And I challenge every listener to ask those questions and how they would have responded to the questions prior to listening to this episode and now after. And the questions were, what is culture? And how do you create culture? And Ricardo, I really appreciate a lot of what you said, but there are some clear takeaways for me that I'm going to remember long after our conversation concludes. The first one is when you talked about that unity, that clarity piece. You dove into, if you don't have a clear and compelling culture, people will define their own culture in an organization. And then you stressed to us the danger in this because there's no clarity. That's really important. The second piece that I thought was really important that I want everyone to evaluate for themselves and think about this as it pertains to your own organization is you cannot have a large diversity of beliefs within a healthy culture. Do you have a ton of people in your organization that have different beliefs? I think that was really important, what you mentioned there, Ricardo. The third piece is you said my beliefs will create my values. I think this is really important exercise for us to just think about, right? If you went through every C-suite executive in your organization, would they give different beliefs that they have? Would they define culture differently? Would they define the values differently? It's really important to understand where our values even come from in the first place. And then the fourth thing that you mentioned that's a big takeaway for me is what you mentioned regarding AI. You said that there's an erosion of trust. And I really appreciate you mentioning that you have an ethics statement as it pertains to how you're utilizing AI. I think every organization should think about that in a big way. That's really important. So, Ricardo, again, I really appreciate our conversation today. If people want to get more information on you, what you do, they want to reach out to you for your services, where's the best place that they can go to get that information?
Send me an email, ricardo@bilingualamerica.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I think my handle is Ricardo Gonzalez 1. I believe that's it. And connect with me on LinkedIn. It'd be great. Of course, bilingualamerica.com is a company website, primarily promoting our language courses. We do a lot of cultural leadership development, things like that, but we do that in different places. So it's, but look, the other thing I do want to say this, sometimes when I do this, it can create sometimes more questions, right? So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Just reach out and ask. I'm pretty open with people, and I like to help people. And I understand that these are things that we all are struggling with. And I understand that they're challenging for us, but if I can help, I'm certainly more than willing and happy to do so.
I appreciate you sharing that. I will include your links in the show notes. People could just click and go from there. Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you found this discussion helpful, please leave a review, since positive reviews help others find these conversations. New episodes drop regularly, so stay tuned. And remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to take action, you must share more stories.